Ryan Nobles, good morning.
All that scholarship help you can.
Because let me tell you something, the bigger her grades, the lower my payments.
Yes.
So, good morning, Ryan Nobles.
Good morning, Bill. Can I just say before we start how exciting it was to see Clinton, New York, featured on national television last night? And you remember I started as a sports reporter at WKTV, and I've been in Clinton Arena many, many times. It was so exciting to see them get that recognition, and I'm so happy for everybody in Clinton.
Yeah, it was really awesome.
We've all been waiting for you to go back to what you're good at, so I'm just kidding. That was left over from the roast, Ryan.
Zing!
Ryan, it was left over from the roast. I had to. You let me.
Whoa.
You walked right into it.
Whoa.
Good morning. How are you, by the way? I was only kidding.
That was like the fastest walk back of a joke ever.
All right,
probably
Ryan.
indicates how good I was at it.
It really, I got to tell you, though, you used to do the, what was it, the Ryan Noble's Challenge or the Noble Attempt?
The Noble Attempt.
Yeah.
Noble Attempt. Yeah.
Which was, he'd go out and, if a kid could hit a home run, Ryan would be out there with a bat in his hand, not hitting a home run. It was really, it was a great.
Well, was the idea if you had a home run hitter, you had to strike him out or you had to match his feet?
It was more matching feet. So, for instance, in Clinton Arena, you guys are jogging my memory on this. I actually did a Noble Attempt where, a 7-year-old girl taught me how to figure skate, and she's like doing all these pirouettes and flying all around the ice, and I'm stumbling around like a fool. So yes,
that was, and I'm sure you've saved all those segments. I hope anyway. So
I have them. Somewhere. I haven't shown it to my kid yet. I haven't subjected myself to that.
That was good stuff, though. All right, let's talk about. I want to start off with the president's comments yesterday because I have a theory here, and you'll push back on it. But the president boasts. Here he is, speaking to the leaders of the world, and he opens up like he's doing a campaign speech in South Carolina. Listen to this. Well, for some reason I got audio playing. Well, you know what he said. He basically started boasting.
That was the intro music.
He started, and then people started laughing, and my theory is, who wrote that speech, Ryan? And whoever wrote that speech is the author of the op-ed in the New York Times. Because
he's setting him up for failure.
Setting him up for complete failure.
Yeah. Interesting theory. It's probably not true.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, but I actually think it probably gives us more insight into the president's blind spot when it comes to his own perception around the world. I think that he spends the vast majority of his time in front of friendly audiences who tell him everything that he wants to hear. He watches the echo chamber of Fox News, which continues to reinforce that concept. So when he goes into what is, a predominantly hostile environment, and President Trump is not alone in that. Most American presidents find themselves in at least somewhat of a confrontational setting when they go into the UN, because the United States has to be, to a certain extent, the policeman of the world that has to go out there and kind of set the moral standard. And so I think he thinks every time he gives a speech, it's going to be to a rapturous audience, and that he just didn't understand the climate that he was in front of, and as a result, he embarrassed himself a little bit, I think.
Well, it's funny because he's like, I didn't expect to get that kind of reaction there. But later in the day, he said, I did. It was meant to be funny, which we know isn't true. But that was. I'm pretty sure he was reading off the teleprompter, and somebody had to write that for him. Who would do that?
Well, I don't specifically know who would write a foreign policy speech like that. Stephen Miller, who is
I believe it was Stephen Miller that wrote that speech yesterday.
I mean, I don't know if it was him specifically. Usually what happens is there's a variety of speechwriters that contribute to something like this. So there might be someone in charge of the prose, but then they also have policy experts that are going to weigh in on the specific language. Because what's so interesting about speeches like that is that they could set serious diplomatic tone, so you have to be very careful in your language, which kind of further emphasizes your point there that what was whoever wrote this speech thinking when they would have put that into the teleprompter for him to go out and boast like he was at a rally at South Carolina, when in reality, the goal of a United Nations speech is to show the diplomatic side of the United States in ways that we can work together with other countries instead of just boasting about how wonderful we are. I don't think most of those countries want or need to hear that, and the president didn't seem to understand that, or his aides that helped him write it.
And then he followed, of course, with what I think he intended to talk about, and that is America first, and these countries around the world should be doing the same thing. Globalism is not the answer. Patriotism is, which I guess we could argue that, but basically a belief that your country is the greatest and to make your country the greatest. That was his message, and probably not going to be the one that goes over all that well at the United Nations of all places.
Yeah, I mean, the United Nations, which, a lot of Donald Trump supporters don't like, and the president himself has been criticized for, it's really kind of the center of globalism, right? I mean, when the United Nations was established, it was a way to get all these countries of the world to cooperate, and an argument can be made that opened the door to free trade and, organizations like the European Union and things along those lines. And Donald Trump supporters hate that, right? They think that type of globalism hurts American manufacturing jobs, that it makes us come second to other nations in the world, the reason we have a trade deficit and all those things like that. And you can make arguments back and forth on either side. So the other thing we have to keep in mind about this bill is that even though the president was probably embarrassed, didn't like the way he was received there's a good chance that the vast majority of his audience, his hardcore supporters, which he is always speaking to, were impressed that he went in there in front of all those other world leaders and declared the United States the best country in the world. That's what they want to hear. They don't want a president that goes in there and kowtows to these other world leaders. They want someone that's going to stand up and say, listen, you're on our turf here. We're the best, and deal with it.
Sure.
So I have to imagine that speech, and keep in mind that, I even saw yesterday that Fox tweeted out 2 separate links to the speech that carefully omitted the laughing. So, in the president's echo chamber, there's probably a lot of his supporters who don't even know that he was laughed at by other world leaders.
You're saying they edited that out?
Well, there was they sent out 2 separate links to the speech, and one was right before the laugh, and the other was right after.
Interesting. All right.
I mean, I'm not saying I didn't watch Fox News all day. They very well may have played the laugh. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying these little short bursts of information. Yeah,
I want to do a little lightning round here. Just that I want to throw a few things at you because the big thing is Kavanaugh. We're going to get to, but I want you worked in New York State government. You worked under Joe Griffo. You ran for office yourself at times. The governor, Governor Cuomo, yesterday came out and said that people are leaving New York State, but it's because of the climate. They're going for warmer weather. Your take on that?
Well, Bill, and not to get back into my political history, but that's the reason I ran for the state assembly more than 20 years ago, was because I just felt that there was an inhospitable economic climate for young people in particular, that I just didn't feel that there was enough opportunity for young professionals to find their way. And I haven't lived in New York for, 15 years, so it's hard for me to get into the specificity of that. But it's not just because the weather is cold.
Right. Climate, you could stay with climate. I like your economic climate. I think that's
right. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a variety of things, and there's certainly no doubt that a lot of people move down south because they like the weather. But I mean, that had nothing to do with our calculus for leaving upstate New York, and we still love upstate New York.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of people who, and the funny thing is, I big Bills fan. I wear my Bills shirt everywhere, and I run into upstate New Yorkers everywhere in this part of the country, and they all pine for the lifestyle that they had when they grew up, and they loved it. And I've not talked to one person, honestly, who's told me that they moved just because it was too cold in upstate New York.
Yeah.
I mean, for those of us that were born and raised in upstate New York, you never knew any different, so it didn't matter. So I mean, I'm not saying that's not a reason that people move, but I find it hard to believe that that's the primary reason.
Okay, I want to talk to you about Bill Cosby and your take on that yesterday. And also his publicist coming out and saying the most racist trial in American history.
Another example of tone deafness,
you think?
Bill.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of Bill Cosby's accusers are of many different races.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not as if this was just white women versus a black man. And I just think that, this is someone who doesn't seem to understand, and the people around him don't seem to understand that the way the country perceives this type of abuse and harassment is no longer acceptable. And finally, Bill Cosby was held to account in a court of law. And, even Bill Cosby himself has admitted in depositions that he conducted himself this way.
Yeah.
And so the idea that he was somehow the victim of racial injustice. And there's not to say that there's not racial injustice in our court system, but the idea that Bill Cosby, who's incredibly wealthy, was beloved by millions of Americans, had an unfair shake at 2 different trials, keep in mind.
Yeah.
I just think is not accurate. And for him to lump it in with the Kavanaugh hearing and then compare Bill Cosby to Jesus Christ, I mean, I think all of those things show that this guy clearly doesn't have a very strong understanding of what's going on here.
When you pull the Jesus card, you know you're overreaching.
Oh, yeah.
It's just,
yes.
You don't have much to go on. All right, so Brett Kavanaugh, the next 3 days are going to be because Avenatti is coming out with his, he says, a credible accuser later today. Of course, tomorrow we might see testimony. It looks like we're going to, and then Friday a vote. What do you think is going to happen?
I mean, I still don't see a scenario unless he really, really stumbles all over himself in this hearing on Thursday where he doesn't make it. Republicans seem very insistent that they're going to push this nomination through. In fact, they've already sent signals to the senators to be prepared to vote on the floor for his confirmation as soon as Saturday. So to stay through the weekend, if it comes to that, they could vote out of the committee on Friday morning if they feel the hearing has gone well enough. And I actually think, while I don't think that Judge Kavanaugh has helped himself at all in the last 36 to 48 hours, I do think that the Avenattis of the world and this latest allegation in the New Yorker, even though it seems as though things are piling up, they actually give him an escape route to a certain extent. With each new accusation, there are holes that are easier to poke in these scenarios. You can take the Ford allegation and then lump it in with this new one from the New Yorker, even though they're two completely different things. And I think what the Republicans are just looking for is they just need a narrow opening here where he has enough plausible deniability that they can then ram the nomination through. And then once he's on the Supreme Court, he's on the Supreme Court for life. So, I do think it's a risky proposition considering the midterms, and I think suburban women in particular are going to play such a huge role in the vote, and they're the ones who might be the most offended by the way this situation is handled. I mean, it all depends on Thursday. I was, this Fox News interview was unprecedented.
Yeah.
No Supreme Court nominee's ever done anything like that. I don't necessarily think he performed all that well. Not to say that I don't think he was credible, but he didn't seem that confident in his answers. And if he's shaky like that in this hearing on Thursday, that could spell trouble. And then, of course, we've never heard from Dr. Ford. We don't know her story. If she comes out and gives a very convincing and compelling argument, that could make life very difficult for Judge Kavanaugh.
Very interesting. And I got to say, the one thing that I found is he came out and said during the Fox interview, he has never consumed alcohol to the point where he doesn't remember. Yet he has people, guys as well, coming out from classmates saying that's not true. He was a heavy drinker and he was a bit mean when he drank. So a lot of it's going to be who believes what, and really this is all probably for show. You're probably right. He's probably going to be confirmed. And what happens after this? Does it help or hurt the Democrats? We'll only find out on Election Day in November.
And I do think the other part of that too is, when he makes claims like he doesn't drink to being blacked out and doesn't know what he's talking about, when he claims that he was a virgin until after college, like that. I mean, I thought that was odd that he threw that into the conversation. But then he has, there's people that are coming out and telling competing versions of that narrative. That just speaks to his overall credibility. And when you're able to poke holes in that, that's where there could be trouble. So I think that's another thing to keep an eye on.
All right, Ryan, thanks as always. We'll do it again next week. Ryan Noble, CNN, thanks so much.
Bye-bye.